At 5:40 in the morning, before anyone else in the house is awake, Marcus turns on the kitchen radio and keeps the volume just above silence. He has done this every morning for over 30 years, in every house he has ever lived in, whether his wife and children were home or not. If she is asked, his wife will say he simply likes background noise while he makes coffee. What she does not know, because he has never told her, is that an empty, silent room has never once felt safe to him. That single habit, small enough to go unnoticed for decades, holds the shape of something much larger. To understand why a grown man cannot stand a quiet house, it helps to go back to a block on the east side of a mid-sized American city sometime in the middle of the 1980s. When Marcus was 11 years old and the neighborhood he loved was quietly becoming a different place. Before that, the block had been ordinary in the way most working-class blocks are ordinary. Women sat on stoops after church, trading gossip while they shelled peas into paper bags. Men worked shifts at the plant or the rail yard, and on Friday nights someone always had a grill going in a driveway. Kids ran between yards until the streetlights came on, and everyone's mother could yell a child home from 2 houses away. Marcus's father worked construction when there was work, and on good weeks he came home smelling like sawdust and told stories that made the whole kitchen laugh. Then, over a handful of years, the block changed in ways no one had a name for yet. A house 2 doors down began attracting cars at odd hours, engines idling for a minute or two before pulling off again. A man who used to coach Pop Warner football stopped showing up to practice, then stopped showing up anywhere. Marcus's father, who had always been steady, started disappearing for days at a time, and when he came home he was thinner, quieter, and increasingly unfamiliar. A man wearing his father's face but not quite his father's presence. Public health researchers who have studied that period have connected the rapid spread of crack cocaine through black urban neighborhoods to a sharp rise in family separation, incarceration, and community-level instability, concentrated in exactly the kinds of working-class blocks Marcus grew up on. For a child, none of that language existed yet. What existed was a father who used to be there and increasingly wasn't, and a mother who worked doubles at the hospital cafeteria to cover what he no longer could. One person on the block did not disappear. Deacon Willis, who ran the youth program out of the church basement 2 streets over, kept the doors open on weeknights whether 5 kids showed up or 20. He never talked about what was happening to the neighborhood directly, but he made sure there was always a folding table with somewhere to do homework and someone willing to check it. Years later, Marcus would understand that the deacon had been quietly holding a dozen boys' lives together at once, and that he himself had been one of them without ever fully realizing he needed to be. Marcus's cousin Tyrell, 4 years older and the closest thing he had to a big brother, began running errands for older men on the corner before Marcus turned 12. It seemed, at the time, like status, new sneakers, folded cash, a kind of respect the other kids didn't have. By the time Marcus was 13, Tyrell was in a juvenile facility upstate, and the older men who had once ruffled Marcus's hair on the stoop had stopped meeting his eyes, as if he too were now something to be careful around. The clearest memory Marcus carries from that year is not the sound of anything. It is the absence of sound. The afternoon his friend Dwayne was killed in a shooting connected to a dispute between 2 dealers neither of them knew personally. The block had gone strangely quiet for hours beforehand. No radios on porches, no kids on the corner, no bass thumping from a parked car, not even the usual argument drifting out of the Hendersons' back window. Marcus noticed it and did nothing with the noticing, because he was 13 and did not yet know that silence could be a warning rather than a relief. He has spent the decades since then, without ever fully realizing it, refusing to let a room go that quiet again. What Marcus formed that year, in the wordless way children form their deepest beliefs, was something close to a rule. If I stay alert enough, I can see it coming next time. He did not choose this lesson consciously, and no one sat him down to teach it to him. It simply arrived, the way a callus arrives on skin that is asked to do too much too often, and it hardened into a permanent part of how he moved through the world. This is where Marcus's story becomes less about one boy on one block, and more about a wider pattern researchers and clinicians have documented in people who grow up under chronic, unpredictable threat. Psychologists describe hypervigilance as a nervous system that has learned to treat calm as suspicious rather than safe, constantly scanning for the next disruption even in objectively secure environments. For Marcus, that scanning has never fully switched off. He still chooses restaurant seats that face the door, and he still, without noticing he is doing it, counts exits in unfamiliar buildings. A second pattern shaped him just as deeply. Psychologists call it parentification, the process by which a child takes on adult emotional or practical responsibilities before they are developmentally ready to carry them. With his father increasingly absent and his mother stretched across 2 jobs, 11-year-old Marcus became the one who walked his younger sister to school, who learned to stretch a grocery budget, who learned to sound calm on the phone when his mother called to check in from work. He was praised constantly for being mature beyond his years, and the praise, though well-meant, quietly taught him that his value lived in what he could handle rather than in who he simply was. None of this arrived in Marcus out of nowhere. His mother had grown up the oldest of 6 in a household with its own version of scarcity, and she had learned decades earlier that asking for comfort rarely got a person anywhere useful. Researchers who study how coping patterns move through families sometimes describe this as intergenerational transmission. The passing down not of a single trauma, but of the survival rules built to withstand it, and Marcus's mother handed her son the same rule she had been handed without either of them ever naming it out loud. A third pattern showed up not at home, but at the boundary between home and the rest of the world. By middle school, Marcus had learned to become 2 slightly different people depending on where he stood, looser and louder with the boys on the block, careful and controlled around teachers and store clerks, who seemed to be waiting for a reason to be nervous around him. Researchers who study this kind of adjustment sometimes call it code switching, and while it can be a useful social skill, for Marcus it also meant that almost no space he moved through ever got the whole of him at once. Alongside hypervigilance, parentification, and code switching, Marcus absorbed something researchers who study chronic stress in Black American men sometimes describe using the term John Henryism, named for the folk hero who worked himself to death to prove he could outperform a machine. The concept describes a pattern of high-effort coping, in which a person meets prolonged hardship not by asking for help, but by working harder, staying stronger, and refusing to show strain, often at real long-term cost to physical health. It is not hard to see that pattern in a boy who decided, at 11, that the safest response to chaos was to become unshakable. Underneath all of it sat a 5th pattern, quieter than the others: emotional suppression, the gradual narrowing of which feelings a person allows himself to show. Fear, in particular, became something Marcus learned to hide almost perfectly, because a scared 11-year-old could not also be the one his mother and sister leaned on. Grief followed the same path a few years later, after Dwayne died, when Marcus attended the funeral, absorbed his aunt's crying and his mother's silence, and never once let his own face show what he felt. These 5 patterns rarely worked alone. They braided together into a single presentation: a calm, capable, watchful young man who never seemed to need anything from anyone, and that presentation carried a real cost even as it carried real benefits. Hypervigilance kept him physically safer on blocks where inattention could get a person hurt. Parentification made him genuinely useful to a mother who badly needed the help. Code switching kept him out of trouble with teachers who had already decided what kind of boy he might be. Emotional suppression let him function on days when falling apart was not an option. By the time Marcus finished high school, 2 paths seemed available to boys from his block: something steady and unglamorous, or something fast that had already taken Tyrell and buried Dwayne. Marcus chose steady almost on instinct, taking a warehouse job the month after graduation instead of the community college enrollment his guidance counselor had pushed, because a paycheck every 2 weeks felt like the closest thing to safety he knew how to buy. He told himself, and later told his mother, that he simply wasn't the college type, when the truer answer was that uncertainty of any kind, even an ordinary and survivable kind, had started to feel unbearable to him. The same traits that protected Marcus at 11 began working against him by his 20s. What looked like maturity at 11 read as emotional distance at 25, when his first serious girlfriend told him, in frustration, that she never knew what he was actually feeling because he answered every hard question with a joke or a shrug. What looked like responsibility at 11 became an inability to delegate at 30, when Marcus, newly promoted to shift supervisor at a distribution warehouse, found himself unable to trust coworkers with tasks he had always assumed only he could do correctly. The workplace brought its own version of the old lesson about being watched. As one of the few black supervisors in his building, Marcus often felt he had less room than his colleagues to appear uncertain or overwhelmed. A pressure researchers who study minority stress describe as the added psychological weight of navigating spaces where a person feels their mistakes will be read as representative rather than individual. He rarely said this out loud, even to himself, but he prepared for every meeting a little harder than the job strictly required, as if competence were a debt that could never quite be paid off. Marriage in his early 30s brought the older pattern into sharper focus than anything before it. His wife, who grew up in a calmer household 2 states away, wanted the kind of conversations where 2 people said, out loud, that they were scared or hurt or overwhelmed. Marcus wanted, instead, to fix whatever was wrong quietly and quickly, the way he had learned to fix things at 11, and he genuinely could not understand why competence wasn't enough for her. It took years and more than one difficult conversation before he began to see that his silence was not proof of strength, but a wall he had built so early he had stopped noticing it was there. Fatherhood complicated the picture further, and it did so twice. When his son was born, and then his daughter Simone 3 years later, Marcus promised himself both children would never have to grow up the way he did. And in most practical ways he kept that promise: steady work, a safe neighborhood, 2 parents in one house. What he could not give as easily was his own fear, his own sadness, the ordinary emotional whether other parents seemed able to show their children without shame. At Simone's college graduation, he excused himself to the parking lot for several minutes rather than let anyone watch him cry, telling her afterward only that the sun had been in his eyes. His son, now nearly grown, has told him more than once that he loves him but has never really known him, a sentence that lands on Marcus harder than almost anything else in his adult life. Friendship carried a quieter version of the same wound. When Marcus had a frightening chest pain scare in his mid-40s, he drove himself to urgent care, sat through the tests alone, and only mentioned it to his closest friend, a man he had known for 20 years, weeks later, and almost as a joke. Unable to explain even to himself why asking someone to sit with him in a waiting room had felt like admitting defeat. For some men who share Marcus's history, the long-term toll shows up less in relationships and more in the body itself. Chronic hypervigilance keeps the nervous system in a low-level state of alert for years or even decades, and researchers studying prolonged stress exposure have linked that kind of sustained activation to elevated blood pressure, disrupted sleep, and a general wearing down of the body's ability to recover from strain. Marcus has struggled with high blood pressure since his 40s and grinds his teeth badly enough at night that his dentist has twice replaced his mouthguard. Physical facts he has never once connected, out loud, to a block that stopped making noise one afternoon in the 1980s. It would be inaccurate, though, to describe Marcus only as a man shaped by damage. The same watchfulness that exhausts him has also made him extraordinarily good at his job, able to spot a safety problem on the warehouse floor before it becomes an accident. The same reflex toward self-reliance that isolates him from his wife has also made him the co-worker everyone trusts in a crisis, the uncle every younger cousin calls when something goes wrong, the kind of man 3 separate neighbors have handed spare keys to over the years. Whatever else the crack epidemic took from boys like Marcus, it did not take their intelligence, their loyalty, or their capacity to hold other people up. It also matters to say plainly that not every black man who came of age on a block like Marcus's carries these exact patterns, and not every version of this story ends the same way. Some absorbed the era's chaos and built lives defined by openness rather than armor. Others carried wounds far heavier than Marcus's, and some did not survive the era at all. What research on that period does suggest is a shared set of pressures: sudden loss, unstable households, and communities asked to absorb enormous harm with very little outside support. That shaped an unusually large number of men from that specific place and time in recognizably similar ways, even as each of them lived it differently. There is a generational layer to this story as well, one Marcus has started to notice mostly through his own children. Where Marcus's generation was taught, implicitly and explicitly, that strength meant silence, his children's generation has grown up with a different vocabulary: therapy, boundaries, mental health, feelings named out loud without embarrassment. Marcus does not think his children's generation had it easier, exactly. He has watched them face pressures of their own, different in shape from his, from a faster and more exposed world than the one he grew up in. But he has noticed, with something between envy and relief, that Simone can tell him she is anxious about a job interview in a single plain sentence, a sentence it took her father 4 decades to learn how to say about anything. His wife has slowly come to understand that his silence was never really about her. What she once read as coldness she has learned to read as a kind of vigilance turned inward, a man still, on some unconscious level, guarding a house against a danger that stopped being real decades ago. That understanding has not solved everything between them, and Marcus still catches himself deflecting hard conversations with a joke more often than either of them would like. But naming the pattern, even imperfectly, has given both of them a way to talk about it that did not exist before, and has made it easier for Simone and her brother to ask him direct questions he once would have deflected without either of them noticing. What looked for years like an odd, mildly controlling habit, the radio, the porch light, the seat facing the door, was never really about background noise or comfort at all. It was a 13-year-old's attempt to make sure he would never again miss the warning signs before something terrible happened, carried forward, unexamined, into a body now in its 50s. What sometimes read to coworkers as arrogance, an unwillingness to hand off a task, was in truth its opposite, a quiet fear of becoming someone people could no longer count on. Understanding that does not erase the real ways his silence has hurt the people who love him, and Marcus has stopped using his childhood as a reason not to keep working on that. Both things he has slowly learned can be true at once. The habit made sense once, and it is still today his responsibility to unlearn what no longer serves him. Not long ago, Marcus's son, home for a weekend before starting a job across the country, came down to the kitchen at 5:40 in the morning and found his father standing at the counter with the radio on low, the way he always had. Instead of walking past it the way he used to, the son asked, for the first time in his life, why his father always did that. Marcus stood there for a long moment, coffee going cold in his hand, and then haltingly began to tell him about a block that went quiet one afternoon in 1986, and a friend named Dwayne and a rule an 11-year-old boy made in the silence afterward, and never thought to question again. He did not turn the radio off. But for the first time in almost 40 years, the sound in that kitchen was not the only thing keeping the quiet at bay. His son was standing there too, listening, and that, it turned out, was enough.